No matter who prevails in the presidential race in Georgia, there is still a strong likelihood of a recount. Doug Richards joins us live to talk us through the process. Doug, recounts are not common here.
No, they're really not, Cheryl, and recounts are certainly governed pretty strictly by state law. And given that a presidential race in Georgia is really a state race for Georgia's electoral college members, they too would be governed by state law. You remember how close the governor's race was 2 years ago. Democrat Stacey Abrams came within 55,000 votes of beating Brian Kemp, but Kemp won, and there was no recount, and that's because the race was ineligible for a recount. Kemp won by a margin of about 1.4%, certainly a thin margin, but not enough to trigger a recount. State law says that in order to be eligible for a recount, the margin between the first and second place finisher has to be 1/2 of 1%. President Trump's margin over Joe Biden as of 3 p.m. today was about 0.25%. That makes the presidential race the only statewide or legislative or congressional race eligible for a recount, and that does not likely appear to be changing. It's worth noting that no recount is automatic, that a campaign has to request a recount within 2 business days after a vote is officially certified, and the certification of these votes that are still being counted here in Georgia is still several days away. Back to you.
All right.